Professor Brown is the director of a very large institute called the Melikian Institute of the University of Arizona at Tempe. The Institute specializes in Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies. I would really encourage you to visit their website to see what they do, because they do a lot. And included amongst the many things they offer is actually a Macedonian language course. And I'm really skimming the surface here in this really short introduction to the Melikian Institute. And I will also really skim the surface in introducing Professor Brown, who has a very long list of academic accomplishments, including writing 2 books on Macedonia, one being The Past in Question, Modern Macedonia and the Uncertainties of Nation. The other one is called Loyal Unto Death, which I just finished reading this morning. And I highly recommend it for the detail and the insight into what was going on in Macedonia, around 1900. It's a really detailed exploration of the state within a state that was the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. There's a lot of stuff there that will surprise and intrigue you. Professor Brown, originally from the United Kingdom, I think came to Balkan studies by exploring land reform in the Ottoman Empire early in his academic career. And he's gone on to certainly produce a lot of scholarship since then. COVID has given us the impetus to reach outside of our local area to invite speakers with their own unique perspectives to share with us. Today's talk on how history will see the Prespa Agreement, I mean, that was a topic, an issue that was all consuming pre-COVID and will continue to generate heat and controversy, I'm sure, for some time to come. And we look forward to having Professor Brown share his perspectives with us. Thank you, Professor Brown.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this invitation. And I also appreciate the hospitality to members of the Melikian board and the advisory committee for the Mary Chonkoff Fund. So I know that Gloria Trykov and Jerry Humphreys are with us from that group. So thank you so much for that. And I'm really honored to be in the footsteps of Lilian Petrov, someone whose work I admired for many years, and so glad to acknowledge that and my debt to her, especially in my work on Steelton in Pennsylvania, where the Reverend David Nakoff ended up after he had been in Toronto for a while, and also Christina Kramer, Dr. Christina Kramer, who I think was the person who suggested I might be a speaker worth listening to. I hope I can live up to that. I'm going to speak from a slideshow and see if I can get it up and see if I can get it to start from the beginning. So can people see that slide now? Yeah, great, thank you. So I want to start, so it's just a little bit of a change to the program, less about how historians will read the Prespa Agreement, but how the Prespa Agreement does or doesn't shape the future of writing Macedonian history, because it's one of the issues that colleagues, especially in Skopje, have expressed as a concern, that the Prespa Agreement somehow constrains the capacity for writing authentically about Macedonian history. And that's a concern for me as someone who plans to continue to work on Macedonian history. But I thought what I would do is, I'll sort of end there with the Prespa Agreement, but I wanted to sort of run through my own background, what brought me here. So Dan gave you a little bit of a clue of that, but I'll talk a little bit more about where I came from and how I ended up working on Macedonia. And then the the sort of frames of reference that I've developed in the course of working in Macedonia. So as again, as Dan alluded to, I've through the course of a couple of books and other research, I've really tried to explore ways out of the nationalist trap that has constrained the region for a while. And from that point of view, the Prespa Agreement is for me, is a turning point. So I want to sort of reflect on that. Then to talk a little bit about my philosophy of history and what I think Macedonian history in particular has to offer the rest of the world, and the points of connection for the rest of the world, and what we can learn from a focus on Macedonia. And then, as I said, I'll talk a little bit specifically about the content of the Prespa Agreement, which sometimes gets short shrift. So I hope to talk for about 30 minutes, and I hope this, I always like to give people a roadmap because it gives them hope that there is an end to what I'm talking about. So the first question that people ask me, and Dan asked me, like, what is my family connection to the region? And I used to give the answer, I have no family connection to the region. And then after that, I gave the answer, well, my paternal grandmother's father was an economic refugee from Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century, and ended up moving to and between England and the United States. But that also feels a little contrived always. Now, though, I feel like I want to answer the question differently, especially in the light of the Prespa Agreement, because as that map on that first slide was meant to conjure, I was born in the United Kingdom, but I was born in Northern Ireland. And that used to feel in the days when the United Kingdom was united, and when the United Kingdom was on a path to closer integration with Europe, so that borders would become less relevant for individuals wanting to cross them. It used to feel like that wasn't really much of a big deal that I was born in Northern Ireland. And now, though, as Brexit approaches and the political wrangling over that land border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland sort of grows in intensity, and people recognize that it's a conundrum, I feel like historical contingency becomes that historical contingency, the fact of my being born there as a child of English economic migrants who then moved back to England. So in some sense, I was sort of born unrooted. I find it a sort of a point of reference and point of contrast with colleagues and friends in Northern Macedonia, Republic of North Macedonia, as they grapple with this sort of redefinition of what their core identity is. So that's sort of my birth connections. But then really, this is something I haven't talked about very much in general. So this is sort of, I'm sort of outing myself here as a wargamer as a kid. So I started studying ancient Greek in middle school. And one of the things that I did outside school hours was become a paid up member of an organization called the Society of Ancients as a 12-year-old. It was a sad youth in many ways. I used to always fight using Greek armies, that is Greek hoplite armies, and I had a particular fascination with the story of the 10,000. That is the army of Greek mercenaries who were recruited by Cyrus the Younger in an attempt to gain the Persian throne, who then found themselves stranded many miles from their homeland and had to organize themselves and march back home. And this is a historical episode narrated in Xenophon, the Anabasis. So it's a sort of seminal text of very, which especially learners of ancient Greek encounter early on. So that was my sort of reference point, and I would fight using an army that looked like the 10,000. And my primary opponent was a school friend who is now the treasurer of the Society of Ancients. It still exists. And he was more pragmatic and less romantic than me. And he always fought with the army built by Philip and Alexander of Macedonia, with sarissa wielding phalangites at the core, the companion cavalry as its striking force. And so we would battle regularly with our carefully painted armies over our tabletop landscapes of hillsides and gullies and woods and olive groves. And it didn't make much difference because he always won. So that was sort of my earliest influence, and one of the first sort of books I read was really pre-scholarly. It was a book by Phil Barker, who was a wargamer and a kind of guru in wargaming circles, who wrote these very accessible accounts of ancient warfare. And so from early on, I was very aware how different the ancient world looked to the world of nation states. So I knew that the various ways that Sparta and Athens and Thebes and the other city-states of Greece really prided themselves on how distinct they were from each other, especially in military organization and ingenuity. And I knew that regions that are now sort of all within modern Greece, Thessaly, Rhodes, Crete, and Thrace, all had their military specializations. And I knew also that whether as patriots or as mercenaries, more Greeks from the heartland of Greece fought against Philip and Alexander of Macedonia than fought for them. And I knew that the historian Arrian makes reference to Alexander speaking to his Macedonian veterans in their own language, which is not standard Greek. So I went on from that sort of those early roots of recognition of the sort of alternative narratives that are embedded in ancient history to college, where I studied classics. And I focused on the period where Macedon, the rise of Macedon, that is the building of this military state by Philip II and then inherited by his son Alexander III, eclipsed the prominence of the Greek nations, city-states. And then the period where that Macedonian kingdom was itself displaced and eclipsed by Rome. I enjoyed in that period exploring what historians like Eugene Borza and Peter Green observed about Alexander the Great, what they refer to as the multiplicity of intellectual appeals that he represented. And I was fascinated by how the Balkans became a major zone of engagement between Roman and Greek cultures, and what happened in the border zone between them on either side of what later came to be referred to as the Eurasian line, where Latin inscriptions end and Greek inscriptions begin. And I was also compelled, as Dan alluded to, by the efforts of figures in Greece, notably Cleomenes, the 3rd century king of Sparta, and in Rome, the Gracchi brothers in the mid-2nd century BC, to address inequality and hierarchy through land reform efforts. So that was my sort of ancient grounding. And that led me to graduate school in anthropology and to the multiple meanings and legacies of the 1903 Ilinden uprising in Ottoman Macedonia. And so it's nice to be speaking to a crowd who know some of that history, and better than most audiences know that alongside Kruševo, the mountain town which became the center of celebrations for uprising in Yugoslav Macedonia, that alongside that history, the revolutionary organization in 1903 also set up temporary governments in Nimfeo, modern Nimfeo, then referred to as Neveska, in the Florina region, and in Klisura in the Kastoria region. So in other words, the conceptual horizons and practical borders of the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization also didn't follow those that were later established by force of arms during the Balkan Wars, and then were institutionalized by the Treaty of Bucharest in 1913. And then those, and also it transcended, the organization transcended these borders, which then shaped Bulgaria's decision-making during both the First and Second World Wars, in joining the Central Powers in World War I and the Axis Alliance in World War II. And then those borders, of course, also then in turn reaffirmed after each of those wars. But I was always interested, or it became increasingly interested in the ways that the world as seen from inside the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization had no idea that those were the borders that would later be imposed. And so in order to really get inside what's going on in 1903, we have to let go of this assumption that these modern borders impinged on people's imagination. So I've published 2 books centered on the sources from the Ilinden Uprising. And the past in question focused on the ways in which the events of 1903 acquired meaning in different communities over the course of the subsequent century. So it was very much focused on the way that history is written. And then the second book, Loyal Unto Death, attempted something rather different, as I just said, to imagine how the revolutionaries of 1903 saw themselves in history and what future they hoped to create for themselves, their communities and families. So this sort of doubleness of history as both seen backwards and lived forward is what I've persistently tried to grapple with in my work. I've also published other work on 20th century Macedonian history, most of which is focused on different episodes of displacement and political activism in circumstances of violence. So I've looked at the impact of the Balkan Wars, the Treaty of the Bucharest and the Paris Peace Conference on the aspirations of Macedonians for political subjecthood. I've also explored how the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization after the Ilinden Uprising became transnational, both with its shift to bases inside Bulgaria, and also its capacity to follow the pathways of labor migration to the United States and Canada in particular, and to raise funds and raise consciousness in North America to continue both a kind of ideological struggle to maintain Macedonian identity or self-awareness, and to sustain a turn to violence and the use of violent methods against what the organization saw as occupying states in the region. And then finally, I've also published on the separation of Macedonian families during the Greek Civil War, which fed into the transnational activism of the Deca Begelci in the 1980s. So my most recent work has been a little bit different, and I do want to just flag it, which is been looking at the 1980s in Yugoslav Macedonia. And in particular, I've been looking at a range of movements which challenged the tight control of Communist Party leadership in the Republic, and changed the style and tone of politics in the Republic, opening up new challenges to the status quo. And again, part of that work is to try and recapture or reimagine what kind of future that people envisaged and were striving towards in the actions they took. And especially trying to look past the easy way that we sometimes impose our own sets of values on actors in the past. So doing that project, I spent 6 months in the Republic in 2012 to 2013. And I was conducting archival and oral historical research into a series of initiatives, which included the rebranding of the youth magazine at that time, Mlad Borec, the birth of environmental activism in the Republic, and the challenge to party officials' abuse of privilege and power, which was led by a group of security professionals who were known at the time as the RSVR 8. So there were 8 leaders within the Communist Party structure who, from their access to privileged information, saw that something was rotten at the heart of the Republic's reliance on party structures and their attempt to go public to restore ideas of accountability. And then many of those strands converged in the nonviolent movement that is my focus, launched in Vevčani, which is a village in Western Macedonia, and that movement was launched after the use of force by militia against peaceful protesters in the village in 1987. So like I said, I'm very interested in the uses of history and what I call the future of the past. So I've had the opportunity in doing all of this work to exchange ideas with a lot of historians and academics in the region, and also had extended conversations with citizens in both Macedonia and Greece. The last time I had an extended period in the Republic was in fall 2018, just ahead of the referendum so late summer 2018, just ahead of the referendum on the Prespa Agreement. And I've also had the chance to interact with US policymakers and professionals in Washington, DC, including the opportunity to brief ambassadors and analysts working on the region. And the most recent of those encounters was in February 2020, when I was part of a discussion group with US Ambassador Kate Burns ahead of the projected parliamentary elections in the Republic of North Macedonia. So that's my background. And I hope it provides a sense of where I'm speaking from and the stakes that I hold in this topic. As I said, I plan to continue to write about Macedonian history and all its richness and connection with wider issues. And I have gone on record as an advocate for the Prespa Agreement. I've just given you a couple of quotes from two pieces I wrote in 2018 and published in 2018, one in February 2018, and the second in June 2018. In the first one, arguing against the idea that resisting, that somehow it was patriotic to oppose the Prespa Agreement. And the second one, again, trying to sort of argue that there are ways to celebrate the resilience of the past and build a better future for the next generation that don't necessarily involve clinging to exclusive models of the past. And these are both true for citizens of both countries, and I'll talk a little bit further about that. But so these are both things I published in 2018. And then at that meeting with Ambassador Burns, one of the issues I raised, and this, as I said, this was in early 2020, was an awareness of the way that after the referendum in the Republic, so just a reminder for people who weren't following it at the time. So in September 2018, the government of the Republic of Macedonia had to, it's part of the way, the conditions of the Prespa Agreement that it demanded a referendum. And this was something that had been discussed in Macedonian political circles going back to 2008, that there would have to be a referendum for this to stick in the Republic. And that referendum was held in September 2018. It was a low turnout of registered voters. There are issues with the with voter registration in the Republic, so that in a country of 2 million, I believe right now, or at that point, there was still over 1 million registered voters, or it was even higher than that. So there's something, historically, there hasn't been a kind of a sort of revisiting of the poll of the citizen registration for quite some time, and so there is always the risk that you can't actually hit the percentages of voters you would want to, because you're counting from a larger number than there are voters in the first place. So the turnout was lower than hoped for, anticipated. Those who turned out were overwhelmingly supportive of the referendum question, which foregrounded this as a pathway to join the EU and NATO. But it quickly became a political issue. The Prespa Agreement, having been pushed forward by the government following this referendum, and then having secured a parliamentary vote on the Prespa Agreement, it became a political liability after the French government chose to block the pathway to accession for the Republic in late 2019. This led to Prime Minister Zaev calling for fresh elections. He felt like it was necessary. He had not delivered on something he had committed to the citizens of the country. And so at the time that I was speaking, or the time that the ambassador had called this group of people together, it was ahead of the next election, where Vămărău de pe Mănere, that is the Nationalist Party and the opposition to Prime Minister Zaev, was calling on Macedonian citizens especially to oppose the government and vote for Vămărău de pe Mănere, partly because they were pitching that the Prespa Agreement was a betrayal of national interests, and it hadn't delivered on what Zaev had promised. So at that discussion, one of the things we talked about was the ways in which the North American diaspora and communities in the diaspora have tended to see the Prespa Agreement in the same way as Vămărău de pe Mănere, that is a kind of abdication or surrender in the face of Greek nationalist demands. And I felt like I suggested that it would be helpful to delve into it and encourage citizens in Macedonia and members of the diaspora community to take a look at Prespa and see what it actually does deliver, and whether there's a way to see it, to frame it in a different way than that. Obviously, as I said, it's the way that Vămărău has framed it. It's the way that the Russian Foreign Ministry has framed it as or has framed the process as falling below the threshold of the kind of consultative process that you would expect from a democracy. And so there's several issues around the Prespa Agreement that demand our attention. So as I said, there's one that thread that the Russian Foreign Ministry flag is this question about the process. So the referendum had a low turnout, and then one of the other criticisms that has been made is that there was Prime Minister Zaev basically struck unprincipled bargains, both with members of the Albanian political parties in parliament and also with some members of the Vămărău de pe Mănere party, in order to get to the 2/3 parliamentary vote that he needed in order to change the constitution of the country and change the constitutional name. So there's criticism of the sort of bargaining that took place. And there's criticism also of the way that the referendum was worded to focus on the benefits and not really and not sort of foreground to citizens that they were voting on a change that impacted their sense of self and their control of their own destiny. And then a further point made by a colleague, Jason Miko, who's a strong opponent of the agreement, who said who went on record saying that the willingness of advocates of the Prespa Agreement to criticize opponents, swiftly brand them as ethno-nationalist holdovers, was unfair and sort of collapsed a lot of categories together. So these are all valid issues for discussion. They're not what I'm going to focus on here. I would just say that my own interpretation in response to Jason's point is that it's the weaponization of the Prespa Agreement by its opponents rather than the agreement itself that does the work of dividing Macedonians against each other, which is one of his criticisms, with a further one of his criticisms. And I also would stress that what I see as important is rather than thinking about it in the terms that in political party terms, I think of it in terms of focusing on how the ways in which the Prespa Agreement represents a kind of move beyond an exclusive nationalism rather than a move in itself of a kind of party politics of advantage of one party over another. I want to talk a little bit more about that now with reference to a term that I'm trying to explore and use in my work on the 1980s, which is this term civicist. And I use it alongside a term that figures during the 1980s in Yugoslav Macedonia used to describe themselves, which was alternativists. And the alternativists were folks like the future president, Georgi Ivanov, who were part of who had close ties to the ruling party. They had paid their dues, and they were not at war with the Communist Party. They were working within the existing structure, but with the idea of reforming it. But then alongside those alternativists were other movements that were more adversarial towards the communist regime. So the most obvious being the role of Dragan Bogdanovsky, who was a political exile and former political prisoner, who was outside the country, outside Yugoslavia, and who was consulted by the founders of Vomero Diplomané when they were creating that political party. And then, as I've also already flagged, the role of diaspora organizations in the 1980s, when movements from Canada and the US and Australia focused attention on the long historical injustices that were still in place after the Greek Civil War, whereby adults who had left Greece as children were denied the right to return to Greece without declaring themselves Greeks as opposed to Macedonians, which felt like a violation of their identity. So there was a set of movements going on in the 1980s that I want to gather under this term civicist. And what I thought I was inventing something new, but then I found that it was used by this in this book, The Importance of Honest Money, in 1897, published in Chicago. It was published under the pseudonym James Adelman, but the book was this was a pseudonym for the utopian reformer Henry Ulrich from Nebraska, and he uses civicist to distinguish from politician. And I've included one of the contrasts he draws in this slide, but I'll just read a couple of others. He contrasts the two by saying civics is born of justice, politics of party success. Politicians hold that those measures which are most likely to bring their party into power are the most important measures. Civicists or statesmen hold that those measures which contain the most justice are the best and therefore the most important measures. And then the last one that I find, the last sort of contrast he draws is, in argument, the politician is usually abusive and loses his temper when the facts suggested by the civicist do not fit the politician's party. He seems to think that loyalty to the party is his highest duty, And if he cannot carry his point by reason and argument, he is justified in resorting to abuse. The civicist rejoices in the discovery of all facts. He always trims his party to conform to the facts. So Adelman, or Ulrich, is making a series of distinctions that I find compelling in the context of contemporary democracy, which tends to sort of increasingly takes the form of a kind of fist fight between two rivals who are operating by the same rules of engagement, but the rules of engagement seem to appear, there are no rules. You do whatever you need to do to win an argument. I would add to Ulrich's language the idea of a commitment to pluralism, where he presents the civicist as willing to trim to conform to the facts. I would suggest instead the civicist welcomes political pluralism. And so into this category in the 1980s, Republic of Macedonia, I would place groups like the organizers of the Film Forum, which was a youth-led movement around debate, the editorial team of Mlad Borac, as I suggested, the environmentalist movement, and that Vevchani-inspired campaign for governmental accountability and transparency. And I also think that for some of its founders, including Ljubcho Georgievsky, the first president of VMRO-DPMNE, the particular brand of identity politics that they began with in the Republic of Macedonia fits this place, especially as for the first years they were willing to play the role, the parliamentary role of the loyal opposition. So this, for me, it's a really interesting moment because in the 1980s, there's a lot of discussion about the ways in which a multi-party democracy will serve as the guarantee that political pluralism can be institutionalized and protected after people are anticipating the end of single party communist rule, and they're trying to build towards a future where pluralism will feature prominently. But if we fast forward to the debate around the Prespa Agreement, it seems like the frame imposed by thinking in terms of politics rather than the frame imposed by thinking about civics has won out. So the multi-party system, which kicked off in the 1990s with something around 20 parties contesting those first free elections, has really sharpened polarization. We've ended up with two major blocks among Macedonian voters and two or more major blocks among Albanian voters, and a kind of parallel existence between the two. And it seems to generate perverse incentives whereby the easiest pathway to appeal to the base is to attack or degrade or humiliate one's opponent, casting them and all they stand for as an existential threat that must be purged or eliminated. And again, I feel this, so party loyalty gets infused with nationalist undertones in particular, and especially by right-leaning parties. And then members of a rival party, especially a rival party that is committed to or tries to advance the ideals of inclusion and pluralism and diversity, is cast as less patriotic or less authentic as representatives of the notion of the people. So that's what I see going on in a lot of the reactions to the Prespa Agreement. So part of it is a visceral response to the left-leaning politics of the Greek and Macedonian parties and leaders who advanced the negotiations. But if we look at the back channel, the sort of sources that are now becoming available through WikiLeaks and other sources of the sort of long debate headed by Matthew Nimitz, the American diplomat who spent 20 plus years trying to figure out how to move past the temporary holding pattern of the early UN resolutions between Greece and the Republic of Macedonia. If we look back at that history of what was on the table when, as early as 2008, some of what we end up with as on the table in 2018 was already being discussed and had already pretty much been agreed by the VMRO-DPMNE leadership at that point. one of the sticking points on the Greek side was this term, the inclusion of this notion of erga omnes. So the explicit reference in the agreement that whatever is decided about the name sort of has to be applied everywhere. And Zayev's account of the negotiating process is really interesting because he describes recognizing this as a red line for the Greek government. And in some sense, by including this language that was the Greek sticking point, what Zayev also did was rule out a protracted future of the politics of derecognition of the kind we've seen with Serbia and Kosovo, where even after countries have recognized Kosovo, Serbia continues to lobby to try and turn back the tide on each individual case and persuade countries to derecognize Kosovo. And Zayev has sort of headed off a similar effort if in fact the Prespa Agreement had allowed those countries who had recognized the Republic under its constitutional name to continue to do so. There would have been this constant parapolitical struggle headed by Greece and its allies to shift them back. And then also by putting erga omnes in, Zayev actually achieved the inclusion of language affirming the existence of Macedonian language, history, heritage, and culture that many of the critics ahead of the Prespa Agreement believed that Greek nationalists would never agree to. So for me, there's the document represents a major shift from what Jason Miko and others perceive as deep-rooted and widely shared Greek nationalism, or that Macedonians, their language and their culture do not exist. And of course, there have been Greek nationalists along the way who have asserted that. But by insisting that those are the only kinds of Greeks there are, I think that the critics of the Prespa Agreement have locked themselves into a kind of logical trap that they can't get out of, because if you go into an analysis of the Prespa Agreement with the view that the representatives of the Greek side are all nationalists who deny Macedonian identity, plus if you go in the left-wing SDSM Zayev-headed team is composed of people willing to sell out the Macedonian national identity, then and if you add to that the idea that it's brokered by international diplomats who don't really care or don't really know what's going on, then you're forced by your own logic to see this as a lose situation for the Macedonian side. It sort of forces interpretation into a box set by the frame that starts with. So as you could probably guess, I want to suggest we approach it in a different way. And I sort of see a model for this in going back to a foundational kind of truism or point of faith in Macedonian history. That is the statement by Goce Delchev, the spiritual leader of the Macedonian movement, who was killed in May 1903. And Delchev himself is a figure that will need to be discussed between Bulgaria and Macedonia, and is being discussed in the same way, or in an extended way from what we've seen in this negotiation between Macedonia and Greece. So he's born and died within the boundaries of modern Greece, attended military school in Bulgaria, worked as a teacher and recruiter for the organization until his death, and his material remains are in Skopje. So his legacy is really tangled between these the three countries of the three of the countries in the peninsula. So I've included here the usual translation of his famous phrase, "Jasko razbiram svetot kako pole za kulturen nadpravar među narodите." I understand the world as a field for cultural competition between the nations. But then what I've also offered, and it's for a number of reasons, a kind of alternative translation of the same phrase. And this is inspired especially by conversations with civic leaders in Vevčani, this village in Western Macedonia, where I've spent a lot of time, as much time as I've been able to in the last few years, because I find so much resonance with the ideals that they set out to pursue in the 1980s. And the way that they framed their struggle against communist, the sort of hold of the party at the time, they frame it as kultura protiv nekultura. So culture against the lack of culture, if you like. And for me, that emphasizes the ties of nekultura with the violence deployed against their peaceful protest in the first place. So that's one inspiration. And then a second is the work of novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who you may know. She wrote a wonderful novel called Americana, sort of with a central character who's based on her own experience, a Nigerian coming to study in the United States. And she also has a very influential TED talk on the dangers of a single story. So she's arguing for pluralism in storytelling and the value of having multiple stories, multiple interpretations coming out of places. And one of her lovely examples she gives is talking to an American reader of her novel, and a novel she's written. She says, I was so sorry. I'm so sorry that you know, having read your novel, I now understand that fathers in Nigeria are very abusive. And she responded, Chimamanda responded by saying, yeah, I've just read American Psycho. I'm so sorry that all young Americans are serial killers. The point being that, you know, if you have plural sources open up people's understanding of other ways of life. So what I've done here is I've taken that sort of notion of kultura from Vevčani, and I've taken what I see as the resonances in Nadprevar, which we use in athletic competition, and it is sporting encounters in which the object is to overcome an adversary while adhering to a set of rules, rather than to eliminate or destroy an existential enemy. And then finally, I've taken Pole and tried to acknowledge the rural audience that Goce Delchev was speaking to in agricultural Macedonia, right? The base of his organization was people concerned with access to productive land. And so Pole is where you plow and where you gain your sustenance from. And so if we translate instead of I understand the world as a field for cultural competition, we can interpret, I would make a pitch that we can translate this as I understand the world as fertile, productive ground for respectful encounter among peoples. And so that, for me, reframes how we think of Delchev, and maybe how we think about the Ilinden movement and the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, not as having this target of an exclusive, pure national state, but building a polity in which there's respect among the diversity that is woven into the Macedonia that they lived in. So that's the sort of frame that I then suggest, well, what if we reapproach the Prespa Agreement, imagining that someone like the second Goce Delchev wrote and negotiated it, rather than someone like the first Goce Delchev? What if we think of it not as a battle that was between two adversaries trying to get the best of the other, but as a kind of place of encounter where you actually share as much as divides you? So one of what I originally sort of thought about doing was working through the whole agreement the way that I meant to give a reference to this in the slides, I'm sorry, but there's an online commentator, Ivan Statinsky, who in somewhat playful mode kind of kept score going through the Prespa Agreement, and he came out with a score by his count of Greece winning the Prespa Agreement 85-10. Because he was giving points to each side in the negotiation. And in a somewhat playful mode, he cast Greece as the moral equivalent of Slytherin which for those of you who didn't have kids reading during the Harry Potter years, Slytherin are the ambitious, unscrupulous house who made a deal with the devil, but always end up being beaten by Gryffindor, who are the righteous ones. So he runs through the first part of the agreement, assigning points in a kind of house competition style. And as I said, sort of ends up declaring Greece won 85-10. Now he awards Slytherin or Greece 10 points for each of Article 7 or Article 8 in the agreement. And again, I'm not going to go through every clause, I'm not going to go through every article, but just I want to suggest that these are the two articles that there has been the most contention about after erga omnes and after the language of Macedonian / citizen of North Macedonia. These are two parts of Article 1, but it's Article 7 and 8 that seem to have the greatest challenge for future scholarly work. They seem to place some restrictions or point conclusions in particular ways. So these two, Article 8 Part 4 and Article 7 Part 4 are both picked out by my colleague and mentor, Victor Friedman, in a forthcoming paper that he's contributing to a collection sort of analyzing the impact of the Prespa Agreement that another colleague of ours, Vaso Neophotistos, is editing. And Victor gave the okay to share some of his reflections here. So he sees in these clauses the potential for erasure of Macedonian language in northern Greece, in the part of Macedonia that is on the territory of Greece. And he notes this because this Article 7 Part 4 seems to make this distinction between the official, it acknowledges that there is a Macedonian language, which is in line with a UN decision in the 1970s. So it acknowledges that, but it appears to open the possibility to not extend that classification of language into the Macedonian language that is spoken in northern Greece. So that's the threat that Victor sees lurking here. And in particular, what he notes is that and the reason it does that is because it's pinning these intangible aspects of human heritage to politically demarcated territories. So it's tying the second party referred to in Article 7 Part 4 is a geographically bounded state. And so what this does is it has the potential to tie these intangible parts of cultural heritage to contingent political units, and thereby reinforce nationalist and exclusive thinking. And then Victor also adds in both of these cases that inadvertently, probably they create space for Bulgarian claims on heritage and language in Macedonia as Bulgarian. And so they actually sort of give wings to a different brand of cultural irredentism that ironically in the 20th century was much more directly linked to physical violence and occupation and threat, that is Bulgarian actions during both world wars, than with Macedonian claims. So I obviously it's important to draw attention to these kind of challenges, but I sort of offer here a more holistic reading and see that the document as a whole gives us an extended expression and exercise of shared will to move past the obstacles of the past 25 years and do so without placing constraints on individual and group activity in the future. So there are constraints on official usage, and there are particular sort of constraints on what gets officially explored here, and that's what Victor is flagging as issues. But if we look alongside those two articles as some of the other explicit language, which seems to, for me at least, seems to create space for a much greater scholarly freedom to explore aspects of the past, then I feel like we can discern here not the results of a negotiation between a group of hardcore nationalists on one side and overly ready negotiators on the other, but a sort of genuine sort of effort to carve out a break with the toxic relationship of the last 2 decades and move into something different. So Article 7, Part 5, nothing in this agreement is intended to denigrate in any way or to alter or affect the usage by the citizens of either party. Article 20, Part 7, the agreement is not directed against any other state, entity, or person. It does not infringe on the rights and duties resulting from bilateral and multilateral agreements already in force that the parties have concluded with other states or international organizations. And it's that second article, Article 20, Part 7, that a colleague of mine, former State Department official, argued as his basis for, as a citizen of the US, which recognized the Republic of Macedonia under its constitutional name, to continue to use its constitutional name. And so the sort of the fear that I've had colleagues in Macedonia express, and especially historians express, that we now have to use an entirely different language in order to write about the past, and therefore are forced to be ahistorical, looks like it's actually not demanded, to my reading, is not demanded by the Prespa Agreement in any way. I want to finish by also pointing out a sort of rereading of that same article that Victor sees as a challenge, Article 7, Part 4, and put it alongside Article 7, Part 2. And these are both cases where at first glance, it looks as if there's a kind of denial of other forms of heritage in northern Greece. I want to flip that and argue that these articles actually offer the opportunity, especially because of the Republic of Macedonia's commitment to protection of other languages and other cultural heritage on its own territory. It actually works to hold the possibility of those same values of pluralism and inclusion to extend into Greece and the way that history is treated and culture is treated in the region. And the reason I hold out that hope, even though these are the articles that Victor sort of points to having the potential for erasure, what I notice in both of these articles and throughout the agreement is the absence of the words exclusive or singular. So in other words, for me, what both of these articles put into place is the acknowledgement that Hellenic civilization, history, culture, and heritage are a part of the history of the northern region of Greece. What they don't say is that's the only civilization, history, culture, and heritage of the northern part of Greece. And what I also notice, as well as the absence of words like exclusive or singular, which were they there, I would say Jason Miko would have a lot stronger basis for saying this is written, the language is that of hardcore exclusive nationalists. Also missing is any reference anywhere to genetic continuity, which is a term that gets used by the more radical nationalists who see identity as tied to these long provable roots of residence in a particular territory. None of that language is there. So again, I feel like the language of the agreement is not generated out of nationalists on one side negotiating with willing negotiators on the other. It's a meeting in the of two parties and two movements sort of committed to moving forward, and they've cut out the more extreme and radical nationalism on both sides of the spectrum to create what I see still as a surprisingly open space. So where Statinsky grades Macedonia's, what I would say, civicist leadership as losing out to Greek nationalist language, I see the absence of exclusionary and exclusive language as a win for both sides and for the future of the past of the region. Because these two clauses, for me, leave open space for the documentation, celebration, or grieving of Macedonia's pluralism, the non-Hellenic legacies and culture of the region, which would, of course, include Jewish, Rom, Vlach, Albanian, and Macedonian dimensions of the story. So my sort of takeaway is that the fear that the language of the Prespa Agreement could legislate out of existence the principles of coexistence and resilience and intercultural encounter, which are core to the territory of Macedonia, is a kind of false threat. I don't think the Prespa Agreement could do that, and I don't think any diplomatic document has the power to do that. What I think instead that this document does do is hold up the promise of opening up channels of travel and exchange and commerce that have been selectively blocked over the past 25 years, and that have served to narrow people's horizons on both sides of this issue and focus their attention on the fear that someone else, some other, is winning at their expense. So for me, as a document that allows for civicist reading rather than only being read through this nationalist lens, the Prespa Agreement has the potential to transform the regional landscape for the better and move both countries past the politics of cynicism and distrust. And it does so while leaving open space for ever more pluralist histories that celebrate human resilience, creativity, and dignity. And I want to finish then with just two examples of things that will be in place and that point to that rich diversity and pluralism of history that will continue to demand our attention and continue to feed into wider discussions of human history. So the first on the left, some of you may recognize, is the monument to the Deca Begalci in Skopje, which was put in place following that first meeting in 1988. And then the second document here I owe to Gloria Trajkov, who I think is still on the call. I hope she is. This was a gift given to Don and Gloria Trajkov by Mary Chonkov, who was a librarian at ASU, and in whose name we have an annual lectureship, and who had established a fund for continuing exchanges between North America and Macedonia. And this is a poster that somehow, somewhere, Mary Chonkov found a playbill for a performance in Gary in 1932, where one of the players was Don Trajkov's father. And so this is the kind of legacy of, as I said, struggles for dignity and representation and a better future that the Prespa Agreement does nothing to legislate out of existence, and in fact, I think, creates space for us to continue to explore.